Good morning, America. Today I'm continuing my series on U.S. involvement in World War II. Today we're going to talk about D-Day, the liberation of France, and the fall of Germany. Operation Overlord, D-Day, June 6th, 1944. The biggest amphibious military operation in all of history. This is the big one, the moment that Roosevelt and his generals have been anticipating ever since the United States joined the war and decided that defeating Germany was the top priority. It was originally supposed to happen in 1942, but Churchill had begged the Americans for help in North Africa, and so it was delayed. Then it was supposed to happen in 1943. It was delayed again because the North African campaign took too long. Now it's 1944, and it's finally going to happen. Allied forces are going to come splashing ashore. Now, the logical place to invade France would have been at Calais, which is at the narrowest point of the English Channel that separates England and France. For that reason, the Allies chose not to invade there because that's what the Germans had expected. Instead, the Americans chose to invade farther down the coast at a string of beaches along the coast in Normandy. The British Channel is wider there, which meant a longer and more perilous trip for the soldiers coming across, but the defenses were not as strong, and the Germans weren't expecting them there. All right. All through the spring of 1944, men and material, insane numbers are piling up in Britain in preparation for this invasion. Every single country that is a member of the Allies in World War II, except for China, I think, has at least a handful of troops there. Everybody is involved. However, the main thrust of the invasion is going to be split between the United States, Great Britain, and Canada. There will be a total of 5 beaches that will be invaded simultaneously. 2 of the beaches will be invaded by the British, 2 of the beaches will be invaded by the Americans, and 1 beach will be invaded by the Canadians. Angry Canadians with guns. Yes. And so that is the plan. They have built the special landing craft with the drop doors. They're going to come across the channel in pre-dawn darkness and hit the beaches just at the crack of dawn for maximum surprise. Now, in the days leading up to D-Day, though, the weather was very dark and stormy. They were hoping to go on June 5th, but the weather was no good. There was a storm. Commander-in-Chief of Operation Overlord is American General Dwight D. Eisenhower, who Roosevelt put in charge of the job because, number one, he was a good general, and number two, he was an even better manager. Eisenhower was a very easygoing type of fellow, very easy to get along with, and good at managing people, and good at managing the sometimes prickly relationships between America and the other Allied countries. Most of America's other top generals have the social skills of a cactus. Douglas MacArthur and George Patton. Eisenhower can actually manage people. So Roosevelt puts him in charge, and that was a good choice because Eisenhower does a tremendous job of it. Day before, though, there's a big storm, so it's going to have to be delayed a day. Eisenhower is looking anxiously to his meteorologist. What's the weather going to be tomorrow? Is it going to storm again, or is it the weather going to clear? Now, meteorology was a bit more primitive in those days. Eisenhower's meteorologist carefully studied the weather conditions, and he told Eisenhower that he predicted that the weather was going to clear tomorrow. On the strength of that forecast, late on the night of June 5th, Eisenhower gave the order that D-Day would be a go for the next day, June 6th. The weather actually turned out to be a decisive factor for another reason, though, because there had been a storm on June 5th. The guy who was in charge of the defenses of France's coastline, Erwin Rommel, same guy we met before in North Africa, he wasn't there. Because there was a storm, he figured, well, there's no way the Allies are going to invade in the middle of a storm. And so he and his wife had gone to Berlin for the weekend for his birthday. So he wasn't actually, the guy who was in charge of the defenses wasn't actually there when the attack came. If he had, things might have gone differently. So in the pre-dawn darkness of June 6, 1944, the assault is unleashed. First of all, American paratroopers land behind, a little bit inland from the coastline, in an attempt to prevent German reinforcements from coming too quickly and disable German gun emplacements. Flights of heavy bombers overfly the beaches and drop heavy bombs on the beaches. There are lots of beach obstacles. Those have to be dealt with. Next, the actual landing craft come. The men come splashing ashore. At some of the beaches, things go relatively well. I mean, there's at least some fighting at all of them. But Gold, Sword, and Juno are all captured relatively quickly with not a tremendous number of casualties. Utah Beach, there is fierce fighting, but there's never really any doubt as to what's going to happen. At Omaha, though, the Americans, Omaha and Utah were the ones that the Americans were in charge of. At Omaha Beach, the Americans just walked into an absolute buzzsaw of opposition. They had to try to take the beach exits. Think of like the ramps, the beach access ramps on beachside. They had to try to take the beach access ramps. The beach access ramps were guarded by concrete pillboxes, bunkers, armed with machine guns. When the Americans try to take those pillboxes by frontal assault, the machine gunners just mow down anybody who comes there. Piles of bodies. Eventually, the Americans improvise a new plan. They climb the bluff, which means making their way through a landmine field. They climb the bluff through the landmine field, circle around behind the pillboxes, and take them from behind. That's the strength of American troops in combat, is when the plan breaks, they're able to improvise and come up with a new plan on the spot. Sergeants and corporals making the types of decisions under fire that are normally made by generals and colonels and majors. And the new plan worked. They circled around and they took the pillboxes from behind. There's some pretty wild stuff that happens on Omaha. This is one of the few instances when you have American women in combat, because a team of combat nurses landed on the beach to tend to the wounded. Female nurses don't participate in combat normally, but they find the beaches are not yet secure, and so they're tended to the wounded with bullets whizzing around them, which is not normally supposed to happen. They don't normally put female nurses in combat danger like that, but it did happen at Omaha. And of course, they took care of the wounded regardless of the bullets whizzing around them. All right, eventually, though, all 5 beaches are secured. Now, the German response to the D-Day invasion is delayed for 2 reasons. Rommel wasn't there. In Rommel's absence, the only person who could give orders to bring in reinforcements was Hitler himself. Hitler, though, at this point in the war, his sleep schedule is about like that of a teenager on summer break. Hitler often sleeps late. And, well, would you like to be the one who has to go wake up Adolf Hitler and tell him that the Americans are invading? All his minions are too scared of him, and so nobody dares to wake him up to tell him that the Americans are invading. By the time Hitler finally wakes up and emerges and is told, oh, guess what, the Americans have invaded, it's almost noon. He orders the counterattack, but by then it's too late. So the American forces succeed in taking the beaches, though at Omaha it was a very near thing. Next, American and Allied forces push through the French countryside towards Paris. This takes them longer than they think it should because the Germans fight fiercely from one hedgerow to another, but eventually the Allies push through. Hitler ordered the commanders of Paris to defend Paris to the last man. The commanders of Paris thought German commanders had been living in Paris for years at this point. They thought the city was beautiful. They didn't want to see it destroyed in the fighting. They disobeyed Hitler's orders and evacuated the city and left the city an open city rather than fight to the last man. So there's fierce fighting in the countryside, but when the Allies actually get to Paris, they walk into Paris unopposed. There's parades down the boulevards of Paris with the people cheering and giving the Americans flowers and chocolate and stuff and welcoming them as liberators. Once Paris is liberated, next priority for the Allies is to seize a crossing across the Rhine River into Germany itself. The Allies try to jump ahead. They attempt to seize a key bridge crossing across the Rhine River in the Netherlands at a place called Arnhem. This attempt to seize the bridge at Arnhem was called Operation Market Garden. Who comes up with these code names? I don't know. Operation Market Garden. They were going to use paratroopers to land, take the bridge before the Germans could destroy it. Unfortunately, Market Garden was too ambitious and it failed. With the failure of Market Garden, the Allies, instead of being able to jump ahead and grab a bridge, they had to fight their way up to the Rhine River and then take a bridge, which took a lot longer. And it especially took a lot longer because in winter of 1944, the Germans counterattacked out of nowhere. The Germans had mustered all their strength and they did one final desperate counterattack. This was called the Battle of the Bulge. And no, it's not a weight loss program. The Battle of the Bulge, it caused a bulge in the American lines, and that's why it's called the Battle of the Bulge. A bulge on a map, not this kind of bulge. So anyway, the Battle of the Bulge, the Germans desperately counterattacked. It was really clever, actually. They sent saboteurs behind the American lines dressed in American uniforms who changed all the road signs so that as reinforcements tried to rush to the front lines, they kept getting lost and they couldn't find where they were because they had mixed up all the road signs. It was very, very clever. But eventually, the Americans were able to bring in more reinforcements. The German counterattack ran out of steam, and the Americans recaptured the lost ground. There was a village called Bastogne, where a group of American soldiers were completely surrounded by the Germans on all sides and cut off. The Germans sent a message to the American commander at Bastogne demanding that he surrender. As the American commander at Bastogne is reading the message demanding his surrender, one of the men around him says, "Aw, nuts." The American commander thought that was a pretty good reply. And so in his letter to the Germans, he wrote, "To the German commander, nuts. Sincerely, the American commander." Fortunately, his bravery was rewarded because at the last second, just as they were about to be overwhelmed, reinforcements arrived and saved the day, and the siege of Bastogne was relieved. So, the Battle of the Bulge, the Germans did their level best, but ultimately the Americans fought back. Alright, with the Battle of the Bulge done, the Americans finally are able to seize a bridge across the River Rhine, and American forces pour into Germany proper. The Germans continue to fight to the last man. For the most part, you start to have some Germans surrender in the final months of the war. Germany doesn't have many men left. Basically, all they're down to is old men, teenage boys, and a handful of top-quality elite SS men. The top-quality SS men fight to the death. Teenage boys and old men, they're more likely to surrender because they don't really want to be there anyway. Now, American troops, as they push into Germany proper, they start uncovering evidence of the Holocaust. Now, I haven't had time to go into the Holocaust. I'll save that for another day. But American troops do liberate some concentration camps in Germany. Ravensbrück and Buchenwald, I believe. So what happens when the Americans show up at the German concentration camps? Typically, all the Germans are gone because they know the Americans are coming. They don't want to get caught there, so they burned whatever evidence they could, and then they took off. The inmates typically are still there, though. So the Americans, they come up to these concentration camps, and they find them full of walking skeletons. The poor Holocaust victims who are still surviving, and then the piles of bodies. The first things the Americans do is when they see the terrible, terrible evidence of the Holocaust is usually they throw up. Once they're done throwing up, then they search the place for any Germans, and they are not in mood to take prisoners. They're furious at what they see. If any German is foolish enough to still be on the premises, they're going to be shot on sight, no questions asked. Once they've searched the place to make sure none of the guards are left, then the Americans will do their best to help the victims. Now, the American combat doctors and medics, they're used to treating war wounds. They're not used to treating, the types of diseases and malnutrition that run rampant in the concentration camps, and they don't necessarily have the medicine and supplies with them that they need, but they do their best to help the victims. The Americans will typically go to the nearest town, grab all the civilians, and drag them down to the concentration camp because the Americans say, look, the locals need to see what their government has been doing. And so they will drag the locals from the nearest town down and show them the concentration camp. All the locals will throw up. Once the locals are done throwing up, then the Americans put the locals to work cleaning up the camp, nursing the survivors, and burying the dead. And there's a lot of dead to be buried. Can you imagine? You're a German civilian. You've been fed over a decade's worth of anti-Jewish propaganda. Now the Americans have come in and conquered everything, and then they've put you to work as a nurse for German concentration camp victims. For Jewish concentration camp victims. Yeah, that would be quite something. The Americans are also very careful to document everything they see. Eisenhower personally came in and looked at some of the concentration camps, and he wrote Roosevelt, he said, there's no way anybody will believe, there's no way future generations will believe what's happened here if we don't document it. So the Americans are very careful to document what they see. On Eisenhower's orders and the orders of other commanders, photographers come in, they take pictures of the camps, they take film footage of the camps, and any documents they find that haven't already been destroyed, they carefully preserve. The documents that the Americans captured were brought back to Washington, D.C. for safekeeping, and they're still there to this day in the National Archives. So anyway, Allied forces are finally closing in on Berlin. The Americans and British are coming in from the west, and the Soviets are coming in from the east. The Soviets actually got to Berlin first, and the Americans and British were only too happy to let the Soviets fight the Battle of Berlin, which was the last battle of the Eastern campaign of the war. It went on for days. It was brutal. They fought house by house and block by block. Hitler is holed up in his bunker, as the fighting is just a few kilometers away from his bunker. He marries his secretary, Eva Braun, and then there is a murder-suicide between them. Students always ask me for more details on this. I don't have time to go into it. Google it if you're interested, but be careful. Don't trust everything you read on the internet about Hitler. Germany is done for. One of Hitler's seconds in command, Karl Dönitz, surrenders unconditionally to the Allies, and VE, Victory Europe Day, occurs, and the fighting is over in Germany. Alright, next time I will talk about the end of the war in Japan and how World War II became the world's first and last and only atomic war. See you later.